I'd like to welcome everyone to the second meeting in July of the IMAG MSM Working Group on Multiscale Modeling and Viral Pandemics. We have two great speakers lined up for us today. I'd like to remind you that the meeting is being live streamed on YouTube and is being recorded, and those recordings will be made available for future public use. As always, Reinhard Labenbacher and myself are the co-leads of the working group. Jim Sluka and Bruce Shapiro are always available as well. You can reach us if you have any suggestions, comments, critiques, and so on. Please feel free to engage. We also have our usual list of communication channels that only work if you use them. Please help us get the word out about the meetings and our recordings, and help us build the presence for the working group. Are there any announcements today? Any short announcements from any of our participants? No. We have a steering committee meeting tomorrow at 11 a.m. So if you're a member of the steering committee, you should have received an invite. If you think you should have received an invite and didn't, please contact Bruce. I wanted to make a note of an RFP for Centers for Research on Structural Biology of Infectious Disease from NIAID. The information is here. The solicitation is NOT AI 21069. And I see Reed Chapman is on the call, so he probably could tell us more about that if there were requests for additional information.
Yes, I'll just make a quick note there that, yeah, that's actually out of our office. Because it's a contract, you have to speak with the contracting officer. We're just contracting officer representatives. But I can put you in, folks can email me and I can route you to the right person to talk to.
Great, thank you very much. And our schedule for the upcoming few weeks, on July 15th, we have the two journalists who were originally going to speak July 1, Martha Mendoza and Alessio Bayak. Both of them are very distinguished science journalists, and I think they should be very interesting to hear from. July 22nd, we have Angela Reynolds, who wrote this very good review of modeling in the context of infection, very comprehensive review. Reinhardt is going to be presenting his work. That's great to see. And then on July 29th, Gary Ann is going to be talking about his modeling of the differences between human and bat immune systems. And we have an open slot for July 29th, if there are any suggestions or volunteers. So please help us fill up our seminar series. You feel free to suggest yourselves as speakers or to suggest people that you'd like to hear from. And as you know, we range pretty broadly. So suggestions that are out of the box would be most welcome. With that, please remember to mute your mics when you're not speaking. It seems these days most of the questions and conversation happen in the after hours discussion. Both of our speakers have generously agreed to stay on after the presentations for an open pit discussion. And I will break in with a 5-minute warning, that is 15 minutes into people's talks, if it looks like people are going to run over. So with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to Evan Patterson, who's our first speaker, and to look forward to hearing his presentation.
So actually, I think we're going to have James talk first, and then I'll talk after that. So sorry about that confusion. So
yeah,
okay.
So we've got it split into. I have some content, and Evan will do a demo and go into some technical details, and then I'll wrap up with applications and conclusions and stuff. Great. So Evan and I together work on a project called Algebraic Julia, which is an open source compositional modeling framework. And we're really excited to be in this IMAG group and talk to you guys today. Yeah. You all are scientists and scientific modelers, and so you're very familiar with the idea of scientific diagrams, where in every discipline, people will come up with a way to draw pictures of the scientific systems and the models that they're making, whether those are electrical circuits, where we call them circuit diagrams, or kind of control block diagrams for signal processing or control theory type systems, or Feynman diagrams for quantum electrodynamics, or quantum circuit diagrams, which quantum computing people use. Any group of scientists will organically evolve some kind of diagrammatic language for talking about the systems they care about. And one of the goals of Algebraic Julia is to formalize these diagrams into crisp interfaces for building, specifying, and analyzing models. And so to do that, we think of a spectrum of scientific computing technology, where on the one hand, you have programs, arbitrary code, they're C++, Fortran, MATLAB. They're programs that when you run them, they simulate a system. They execute a model. They run them. And then at the other end of the spectrum is computer algebra systems, where you are doing mathematical modeling in a computer-assisted way. So you're kind of writing down math, and then a computer program like Mathematica or SymPy reads in that math, reasons about it, and tells you other math. And then in the middle, there's a trend of developing modeling frameworks, which are somewhere between programming languages and computer algebra, programs that have an explicit representation of the model that you're trying to run. So examples I have here are STAN in Bayesian modeling, or Coprasi in biochemical modeling, TensorFlow in neural network-based modeling. They have the programs that have an explicit representation of them. And we call those modeling frameworks. So Algebraic Julia is a modeling framework. It lets you build highly generic code in which you can implement modeling frameworks, a diverse, heterogeneous collection of modeling frameworks on the left-hand side. And then it helps you write modeling tasks or tools that work with those models in a generic way. So kind of once you have a model, the first thing you need to be able to do is run it, simulate it. And then immediately you have kind of higher level questions like calibration. So my model has parameters. I have to estimate them from data. Think of that as calibration. If I have two competing models and I want to know which one is best, I have to do some kind of model comparison. And these are recurrent modeling tasks that come up across every scientific discipline, whether you're doing Bayesian modeling or optimization-based modeling or chemical modeling or physics modeling. You always have these questions of tasks like calibration, comparison, selection, and verification and validation. And so we want to write tools that help you write tools to understand these models. And we want to do it in a way that doesn't require every modeling framework to implement every modeling task. And then you have like a n squared tasks by frameworks. Instead, you want to be able to write these things generically so you can develop your models faster. So we use a technique called category theory, which is a tool from abstract mathematics. It's a branch of algebra that was invented to help see patterns across different areas of mathematics and to make those patterns precise. And if it's mathematically modeling the process of doing mathematics in a way. What are mathematicians kind of interested in? What are the kinds of theorems they tend to prove? And how do we extract patterns from those mathematical ideas? So category theory helps us see very diverse applications through a common lens. For example, I've shown here on the top what a mathematician would call like a proof assistant, which is a tool that helps them prove theorems. In this case, it's about inequalities. So how do I reason about inequalities? And the proofs in this proof assistant would be diagrams in a formal sense, these kind of string diagrams. On the bottom, this very similar mathematical structure can describe chemical reactions. So in a proof, you take some hypotheses and you produce a conclusion by following some logical procedure. And the logical procedure is encoded into this data structure we're looking at. In chemistry, you take some reagents and you produce some products by following a chemical procedure. And the chemical procedure is what we're seeing encoded in the diagram. So kind of on the top, you see the hypotheses or reagents. And on the bottom, you see the right-hand side, you see the consequent or the products. And the diagram in the box is either a proof or a compound chemical reaction. So that's kind of a flavor of how we are able to implement many different modeling frameworks at the same time using these algebraic abstractions. One of the tools that's very helpful, and this is what Evan will get into mostly, is categorical data structures called Csets, and they generalize the notion of a graph. So lots of times, like in chemical reaction networks, you might think of as a graph, maybe a graph with two kinds of nodes. Chemicals are one type of node, here shown in blue, and reactions are shown in orange. And you have arrows that connect the reagents to the reaction and the reaction to the products, shown in kind of gray arrows and dashed black arrows. So these Csets are great because they have data structures that are very helpful in implementing the modeling frameworks, but they don't just come with data structures, they come with algebra. And that algebra is what Evan will talk about, being able to do constructions that are very general. So when we think of modeling, we think of a modeling pipeline that starts with a structural knowledge layer of kind of the semantic concepts of your modeling discipline. Like here, this is kind of epidemics. So I'm thinking of the SIR model. What happens is I have a transmission event where an infected person infects a susceptible person, and then a recovery event where the infected person becomes recovered or removed from the system. Then I have a system specification layer where I have now a precise mathematical encoding of that conceptual knowledge that's algebraic. Then I want to turn that precise representation into kind of a standard mathematical concept, in this case, a differential equation. I'm going to generate a differential equation from my system specification. And then I need to solve it using a standard technique, like a Runge-Kutta solver. That's our modeling pipeline. And we've been involved, I'm not sure how much of the IMAG group has interacted with this DARPA program called DARPA ASCII, but Grace Pang, who's a member of IMAG, we've been interacting with her and some of her colleagues as part of the scientific knowledge extraction program, where you want to think the problem I just described is the forward problem. Given a chemical reaction network or an epidemiological compartment model, these are very similar things. Given a compartment model or reaction network, I want to compile it into a program that solves the differential equation. And the inverse problem is, given a program that a scientist wrote that simulates a reaction network, infer what reaction network that program solves. So that's one of the high-level goals of this ASCII program. And it stems from the idea that a series of DARPA programs about kind of extracting scientific knowledge from the scientific literature that the text in a paper is often insufficient to reproduce the results. And what you need is the source code that goes with the paper. And so with open source technology being heavily used in science, we're able to actually get our hands on this source code and analyze it. So then one of the other goals in the ASCII program that we're working on is modeling framework translation. So once I can extract the system structure from a code, I can reformulate my modeling assumptions and then regenerate a new model under the other assumptions. This example here is showing, assuming I have large populations, my compartment disease model is well approximated by a differential equation in the large population case. You kind of think of the concentrations of susceptible, infected, or recovered people, and you think of mass action kinetics. So I might implement that in code and write a paper about it, and that's my model. But if I want to apply that model in a new context, like a small population setting, like a particular high school, the large population assumption is no longer valid, and I have to use a stochastic process-based model. So what we can do as part of this tool chain is read in a code, extract out the reaction network, and then we could emit back a similar code that solves the same differential equation, or we can emit a stochastic process that we can solve with like the Gillespie algorithm or a stochastic ODE, like an SDE solver. And that's really great because you can kind of change the modeling assumptions on the fly. So the next thing that will happen is that Evan will give the demo, and the goal here is to understand more of the details of how we do these constructions. I think the application for IMAG is these higher level constructions we can do on models are really useful in the context of rapidly deploying novel models. Evan, take it away.
Okay, let me share my. Oh, I think you'll need to stop sharing. Okay, then. Okay, so everyone hopefully is seeing a Jupyter notebook. And so, yeah, so with James's introduction, I'm now going to try to drill down a bit into some of the topics that he mentioned to provide not complete detail, but a bit more detail, both to understand the concept and also maybe to see some of the way that we can use it in compartmental type models of infectious disease. So the first thing I'm going to talk about are these Csets, which are kind of general data structure. I'm going to talk about structured Cospans as a mathematical computational formalism for modeling open systems, systems that can interact with each other and compose. And finally, kind of hierarchical, or to use the technical term, operatic composition for these sorts of systems. Okay, so first thing, Csets. So Csets are both a mathematical structure as well as, in our implementation, then a data structure for relational data. So what you can think of is a collection of different data frames or data tables that are interlinked with each other. So the basic mathematical model is similar to a relational database that you may have encountered, but rather than being a standalone database system, this is an in-memory data structure. And having this categorical formalism of Csets attached to it leads us to, gives us capabilities for doing querying and gluing or data fusion and other kinds of operations in a generic way. So the first example I want to give is a simple one, but it's nevertheless both useful and important, and that's the graphs. So the schema that would correspond to graphs, by which I mean directed graphs, you would have two tables, one for the vertices and one for the edges. And then the vertex table sort of trivial. It doesn't actually have any columns, but the edge table has 2, and those give the source and target vertices of the edge. So as a picture, the schema looks like what's shown here. And in CATLAB, you can kind of directly write down this, schema, and then you can instantiate a data structure that corresponds to this schema using one line of code. And so having assembled that, we can see, for example, what this actually, the underlying data of a directed cycle with 4 vertices has this table, and we can see that it looks like this. Okay, and so if all we could do with this were graphs, it perhaps would not be terribly interesting, but it turns out that lots of other kinds of graph-like things can be modeled using this language. And so it gives a system for rapidly assembling new kinds of combinatorial data structures. So the next thing I want to show is Petri nets. So it was recently observed that a certain flavor of Petri nets can be realized as a C-set for a certain schema. And so for this one, we have a table for the states or places, and we have another table for the transitions. And then we use kind of a common trick in this sort of data modeling approach, where to encode sort of arbitrary many-to-many mappings between states and transitions, we introduce 2 new tables, one to represent the inputs to the input states to a transition, and the other for the outputs. And so this is implemented in a package in our ecosystem called Algebraic Petri, and I'm showing here how one could construct a simple Petri net. So this is the Petri net that corresponds to the classic SIR model. So you come out with a table, which we won't examine in detail, but as a picture, it looks like you would expect. Okay, so that is a sort of a basic building block that we use a lot in our work. So building on that, we want to try to compose models and systems in a principled way. So this is useful both for human understanding, to understand how we can think of a model as being built up from its parts, but it's also useful computationally, so that people can kind of rapidly assemble models without ending up in kind of a spaghetti mess of different vertices and edges going every which way. The technique that we'll add on for this piece is this thing called structured cospans, which is a kind of a scary sounding word, but it actually ends up being fairly intuitive. And so the basic idea of this concept is that we will have some category X where the systems are going to live. So to take our simplest example of graphs, we might have that this category is the category of graphs. And then we want some other kind of category which is going to describe the boundaries of these systems along which they will be composable. And so in the case of graphs, we might just take this category to be the category of sets, where we're going to think that these sets represent subsets of the vertices in the graph. And then finally, there's this last piece, which is a functor that says how these things are related. I won't get too much into that, except to say that, like in the case of graphs, what we're thinking is that this thing would send a set of, which we interpret as a set of vertices, to the graph that has only those vertices. And so with these ingredients, a structured cospan looks like this. So a cospan is a diagram of this shape, and the thing at the top, the apex, represents the system, and then these feet represent. From this picture, we're kind of thinking the system has quote unquote inputs and outputs, and that and then these mappings say how are those inputs and outputs like embedded into the system itself. So to be a bit, that's a bit abstract, but we'll see that it's actually not too hard in a concrete example. So in the case of graphs, we're going to create here an open graph that has its inputs being the first vertex and its outputs being vertices 3 and 4, right? So in this picture, the left leg of the cospan is going into 1, and the right leg is going into 3 and 4. And so the point of this setup is that if I have another graph, which has say these two vertices on the left as inputs and this vertex on the right as its output, that the outputs of the first one match the inputs of the second one, and so we can compose them. And so what is happening here is that we're gluing these two graphs along their common boundary to form a new graph. And so we'll notice that in this construction, I started out with a graph with 4 vertices and another graph with 4 vertices, but my final composed graph has 6 vertices, and that's because 2 pairs of vertices are being glued together. And so this is a categorical construction called a pushout. And so we have a generic system for doing these kinds of gluings that can work with any Cset. So I'm not going to go into detail for like what it would look for Petri nets, but we're going to use that. We're going to see it when we glue together Petri nets. Okay, and so the last piece I want to talk about, and this is the one I'll have kind of the most to say about, is okay, well, we've seen how you can kind of glue things together in sequence, but in practice, what we find is that it's much more natural to think of models as sort of being built up hierarchically, and they have, like there might be some low-level pieces that we understand, and then we want to put them together into a bigger model. And so in order to do this, we'll introduce a couple more ingredients. So the first thing we want to do is allow our structured cospans to have not just 2 legs, but kind of any number of legs. So that's a straightforward generalization, but it's useful in practice because the distinction between inputs and outputs in the setting of like compartmental models is somewhat artificial in the sense that there's not a clear sense of input or output to these systems. And so it's more natural just to think that we can chop up the boundary of the system into different conceptually meaningful pieces, and those are the things that we will glue along when we compose systems. Okay, so we'll have that ingredient, but then more importantly, we have this operatic notion of composition, or hierarchical. And so we're going to use these things called undirected wiring diagrams. And so first I'll just sort of show you what they look like. They're pictures that look like this. So we have boxes, or these big circles, and so those are going to represent the systems. So for example, in the box labeled R, that we're going to think that we might plug into that being a structured multi-cospan with 3 legs. And likewise, we plug in one with 4 legs into T and one with 2 legs into S, and then we'll do a big gluing operation to come out with a composite system. So it turns out that undirected wiring diagrams are themselves a Cset. So it's straightforward to implement them in our system. And so the different tables correspond to some of the things I was telling you about. So there's a table for the boxes, a table for the ports of those boxes. There's another table for the sort of outer ports of the diagram. So you'll notice that there are these dangling wires here. So those we think of as being connected. Our visualization capabilities are some bit limited, but we think of those as being connected to the sort of an outer box, and that's going to define the interface of the composite system. And finally, these junctions where things are glued together are the 4th table. So it's this is showing the underlying data representation of the above diagram, although it's naturally, it's which is useful computationally, although to actually inspect them, it's much more useful to look at the picture. Okay, so so now I want to illustrate what can you do with this in an example which is a bit longer than the one that I did above, although not as complex as it could be. So we're going to look at using these different ingredients to compositionally construct a model of an epidemic in which some people will at various states enter into quarantine. Okay, and so where we're going to start with is with something that we've observed is that a lot of the models in this domain can be built up starting from two basic primitive kind of primitive operations having a certain form. So one of them are these exposure type transitions. So these are going to be open Petri nets that have three legs, and so here we're showing like the Petri net that would correspond to, to a susceptible and an infected person interacting to produce again the infected person and now someone who has been exposed. And then in addition, there are these sort of so-called spontaneous transitions where you just have one state which, at a certain point, has the propensity to transition to another one. So this transition here would represent the an exposed person actually at some point later becoming infectious. Okay, so with those two ingredients, we can say quite easily what is the basic SEIR model. So we're gonna start with we're gonna create an undirected wiring diagram in which these exposure, illness, and recovery processes are configured in this way, where we're just going. It's quite intuitive, right? Like we're going to share certain of these things that have a common variable represent, like the state of being infected, and we're going to share those in this thing. So and then so this diagram is just kind of a composition schematic. There aren't any Petri nets yet, but we can get a larger Petri net by saying, okay, I'm going to do this apply this operatic algebra, and that's just a fancy way of saying I'm going to plug in these specific Petri nets to get a Petri net. So I'm going to plug in an exposure, an illness, and a recovery net, and that's what I'm doing here. And I come out with the Petri net that corresponds to the SEIR model. Okay, but now you might say, well, that's nice. That's a classic thing. But what if we want to add some quarantining to this model? Well, you can say, okay, well, I'm going to take that SEIR as a building block, and I'm going to make a new diagram where I'm going to introduce some other sorts of things. So we're going to imagine that some exposed people will enter quarantine. Also, some infectious people will enter quarantine, and then the quarantine people will eventually recover. So that gives another way of getting to the recovered state. So as a wiring diagram, we end up with this picture, and then we can just sort of keep recursively building up. So we can say, okay, well, when I want to substitute in to get a Petri net, I can say, well, for the SEIR, I can take the SEIR Petri net I already built and plug that in. And then for these other ones, I just have some spontaneous transitions that correspond to going between the different states as I described. So, if we plug those in, we now end up with a Petri net, which is not huge, but already big enough to not fit on the screen in each straight easily. So, you can pretty quickly build quite large and complex models this way in a way that's more reliable and understandable than trying to just piece together the thing all in one go. Okay, and so the last thing I want to emphasize before I switch back to James is that, okay, so we've built up the Petri net. That's still a combinatorial description of the model. Okay, so what about actually, doing something to simulate that model, well, we can pass to yet another representation in which the computational content of the mass action style kinetics associated with that model is readily evident. So we can switch, we can do a data migration. So it turns out that there's a very general technique for doing data migration between Csets that we can apply here to transform this PetriNet model into this so-called bilayer network, which is essentially kind of a computation graph, which shows you, what you need to compute the vector field for that ODE under the mass action assumption. And that's essentially what this computation graph is showing. And finally, having built up that graph, we can compile that to code. So we in this last thing here, what I'm showing you is generated code that would actually compute the vector field associated with this ODE. And what I'd like to point out is that this compiled representation is quite low level. I mean, this is just like, arrays of numbers, the sort of thing that the machine understands and computes. But so like this is not the level at which one would want to reason about the system. And so, it's, I think, a virtue of our approach that we can separate the high level modeling specification from the generation of this code, which no one should really ever have to think about. Okay, so with that, I'll switch back to James.
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, I want to count on that bilayer network and the code that it generates for a second. That code that comes out of that compiler has no loops, no branches. Like, it's just straight line arithmetic, the kind of thing that compilers are supposed to understand really well. All of the high-level information from the PetriNet kind of compiled down into just the minimum number of arithmetic operations necessary. Can't do any better than that. So, but no human has to write it. That's really important. So then I'll finish with some more capabilities that we have. So another good use case for what Evan was just talking about, that's for compartmental models in epidemiology, or mass action kinetics models in biochemistry or regular chemistry, for that matter. But you can turn this as domain agnostic. So kind of generalized Latko-Volterra models for ecosystems is another application we've worked with, where you can think of breaking down your ecosystem into niches that are composed of species, and the niches interact at interfaces. Here, kind of an example is you have an underwater model with multiple species of fish and sharks, and they're engaged in predator-prey relationships with each other. And then a turf model of the land ecosystem, where rabbits and foxes and hawks interact. And then in the air, the hawks and the fish engage in predator-prey relationship. So you couple these systems via shared variables. So you can put very complex dynamics on the component models, not just the law of mass action. And you get quite complex dynamics. So not only can you change the domain in which you're applying these models, you can change the syntax of composition. So we've only talked about kind of one type of composition, where you glue models together along boundaries. But we also have two other flavors. One, which is you compose machines via information flow. So you can have kind of in the engineered systems rather than biological systems, the system interfaces are oriented. So the controller sends a signal to the actuator, and then the body responds to the actuation of the actuator, right? So it's oriented. The actuator can't influence the controller directly. The actuator influences the controller via the thing that's being controlled. So you've got this kind of oriented composition. And then we've got another flavor that's really good for stencils, kind of partial differential equation type computations, which are called circular port graphs, which capture the notion of like a 5-point stencil or a 9-point stencil or something like that. And then we give them all kind of mathematical content as differential equations. So something else you can do with Csets that we didn't demo, but is rewriting, where you can do kind of a pattern, like find and replace on steroids. So you want to find a pattern, like up here, you want to find what this little diagram is encoding is every time you see this pattern, you can replace it with this pattern. And so you look in this graph for this pattern, you find a match, you execute the replacement, and you get this alternative form, right? So this rewriting, this kind of find and replace mechanism is implemented at the level of Csets, which means it can be used for a wide variety of applications. It can be used for any modeling framework you can implement with Csets. You can use this rewriting. So for example, model selection is based on this, where you want to kind of compare lots of different alternative hypotheses. So early in the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of dispute about, is there an incubation period where you're exposed but not infectious? Is there asymptomatic spread where you can be infected or infectious but not symptomatic? All of these different alternative hypotheses can be explored very rapidly because they can be expressed in this rewriting language. And so that rewriting is a tool for writing model selection in a very high level of generality. Other things we can do with our models is kind of automatically generate spatial versions of the model. So oftentimes you have it's easy to write your local dynamics as an ODE. And then you want to say, but what happens if this were to happen over space? So we have a language in which you can specify the local dynamics with a Petri net and the spatial relationships as a mesh. And then automatically compute what is the application of those local dynamics to that mesh. So this is kind of notional little example of an epidemic in a bi-metropolis. If you think of like Washington, Baltimore, or Dallas, Fort Worth, or like Twin Cities in Minnesota, we have like two cities that are connected. And if an epidemic were to break out in one, it would travel to the other quite quickly. So that can be modeled here. And so then you basically see two epidemics, but there are artifacts of the shape that you might want to explore in a spatial model. Like that. And then, parameter estimation. Trying to keep it on the time. So one of the other things you can do with these models is automatically generate parameter estimation code. So Evan showed taking a Petri net and generating a simulator for it. You can also generate a calibration code that will automatically fit that model to data. And so that uses kind of the same machinery of code generation. So here we're seeing a complex model that's built out of component models. And then if you had measurements for, say, the number of infected and recovered people, so this is like SIRD happening in 3 cities. So there's like 3 copies of the SIRD model representing like city 1, city 2, city 3. And then you've got and then flow from one city to the next if they were like on a rail line, like a one-dimensional rail network. So a single drain. So you have that flow. So then you can like take measurements and calibrate that model in a highly generic. So all the models we've talked about so far are kind of differential equations based. In the ordinary differential equations, the time, there's only dependence on time. And then but how do we properly treat dependence on space and go to really complex physics? So that's a project we're working on right now about the exterior calculus, where you know, in what language do I have to write my physics such that I can automatically generate a simulator from that description? So we're working on that, and then which corresponds to kind of doing an axiomatization of partial differential equations. And then, yeah, our broad takeaway from this talk is that Algebraic Julia is an ecosystem for modeling frameworks that lets you build very flexible and generic modeling frameworks to solve all kinds of scientific problems, and hopefully is useful for the kinds of modeling tasks that you guys do, like model calibration, comparison, selection, and verification validation, for all the different kinds of modeling frameworks you would use. And then I'd like to thank the entire Algebraic Julia team for all the effort they put in to supporting this project. It's quite a big team at this point, doing a lot of cool and exciting things, of which we've only talked about a small amount. So thanks for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay. Please dig in. Well, I certainly have some, but I typically try to wait until everyone else has had a shot. So, I mean, I think you're identifying a lot of important problems, and the approach is one that at some level is very familiar to people, because probably most of the people in the room use SPML type model specification. And so the great problem with SPML is it never had the concept that there could be more than one cell in the world. And so they never thought about the idea of composing or stenciling. And there were a lot of groups. There was a group in Brisbane, for example, that worked for years on trying to take SPML models and turn them into PDE models on surfaces of various kinds. And so they were, in a sense, trying to retrofit to the SPML specification the things you're trying to build in from the beginning.
Yep. Yeah, I think so. Just to riff on SPML, I think that this all the things that end in ML, meaning markup language, they kind of build a syntax for encoding the models, and they're not like semantics first. They're kind of syntax first. That, like, how are we going to describe the things we want to describe, as opposed to finding the right mathematical abstractions here. And so we think that the kind of operad, the hierarchical stuff that Evan described are like the right abstractions for expressing the models. And if you don't get the abstractions right, then there's just a ton more engineering that you have to do. And like you said, like retrofitting, taking an SPML model and retrofitting space onto it is going to be really hard.
Well, it's not very different from what you did, actually. You define a set of inputs and outputs, you define a stencil, and then you impose it on a mesh. And it works. It creates the correct PDEs, and it works. It hasn't been, I think, widely adopted, mainly because the compilers and solvers weren't as available. And that's about 10 years ago now, even more, 12 years ago that was done.
Mhm.
But which is not, I'm not trying to say that this more abstract approach isn't very interesting, but I appreciate it more because I've seen that effort through, with SPML. I mean, the ML part doesn't really matter, right? Because nobody writes SPML by hand. You always draw diagrams, or you write a language like Jarnac or Antimony, which, and of course, those are very, very similar to what you're doing in terms of their models, of their structure. What they don't have is the formal elements of composition that allow you to do the interfacing and refinement that you're talking about. Although those can be added, but those turn into decorators rather than something that's intrinsic to the fundamental language specification.
Yeah, I think also they're often tied, like the modeling frameworks that grow up organically in a scientific community are deeply tied to the community they grow up in. Right? They're evolved. They're subject to natural selection, and so they're adapted to the niche that they come up in, and a lot of this stuff seems like retrofitting, right? Like I want to do, okay, so I make a tool like Glazier, an SBML based tool to do reaction networks, and then I like want to do spatial versions. So I bolt on some PDE reaction diffusion capabilities, right? But then I can only solve a certain kind of PDE, or maybe then I have to like bolt on more general PDEs. And at some point you realize like, oh, I'm writing a fully general PDE solver, but I'm specifying them in SBML. So I have a species for the electromagnetic flux and a species for the electrical flux and then the magnetic flux. And oh, I wrote Maxwell's equations in SBML. That doesn't seem right. But yeah, that kind of, I think that's a very interesting phenomenon of how scientists kind of naturally evolve their languages and their modeling frameworks kind of grow up in those languages. It's an interesting problem. It's something that's worth studying from like a linguistics perspective, not my perspective.
Sorry, William, you had your hand up.
Sure. Yeah. Hi. No, thanks for the talk. So I have a question about so if you're doing multi-scale models of things that happen in humans and things that happen between humans, right? Some of the models that you might want to put together are kind of well described continuously, so you can make ODEs for them, and that's nice. And sometimes, you get some of them that are better described because they involve some small quantity of something with, stochastically. And so, I mean, I can see how, you take Petri nets and you generate ODEs for them, or you generate a Gillespie style simulation for them, and that's fine. But what happens when one model or bunch of models in it wants to be done continuously and someone wants to be done stochastically? How do you mix those together?
Yeah, I think that's that is the boundary of this approach. So what we would do currently is kind of find a modeling paradigm that fits both, and kind of include them both into that. And then you can work with them there. But as far as, right, kind of like view a deterministic ODE as a stochastic ODE with no noise, something like where the noise variance equals 0 or something like that. And then you just solve it as an SDE. So that's what we do currently. I don't think that's the right answer. I think you've got to kind of simulate them separately and pass in, because you'll also have a time scale problem there, right? The appropriate time scale for the small scale phenomenon is faster than the deterministic phenomenon. So yeah, so you're gonna have to, this this also comes up in the PDE work that we're doing, where some of the physics happen faster than others, like heat transfer and momentum transfer in fluid dynamics happen at different time scales. And so you have to kind of like, you can't compose the models, you have to compose the simulators. And composing the simulators is much harder. Yeah, I think that's
why can't you add a decorator that says that instructs the system which simulator to use for which, because you have a process transformation approach to defining your models. And so you have a series of processes. So why isn't it possible to decorate the process by telling it what kind of simulator to use and what time scale to use on the solver?
Yeah, I think that would, so that's like decorating it in the model. And then when you go to simulate that kind of decorated model,
your compiler looks at it and says, I know now what to do.
Right. That's kind of what I meant by composing the simulators. You have to kind of integrate.
You can still specify it at the level of the graph.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be, that'd be how you'd have to do it, is kind of carry that information around.
Yeah, I think one thing that's worth saying is that it seems that composition and mixing of different kinds of systems is a lot easier at the level of specification than solving, simulating. So like, so far a lot of our efforts have been focused on kind of compositional model specification. I think we'd maybe like to start looking at more aspects of, well, can we actually do the solving compositionally too? But I think it's fair to say that that's a challenging problem.
So I have another question that's at some level related to the one William brought up, which is that probably most of the people in this room do agent-based modeling. And so in our case, the topology of the network is not static. It's emergent. Because you have a set of interfaces for your agents, but who you're interacting with and how you're interacting with them will depend on the state of the model. And it interested me, you didn't use words like state and configuration, which are ones that I'm used to hearing in this kind of discussion context.
So the state,
but I wondered how you deal with this with dynamic connectivity of networks.
Yeah, that's actually something Evan's working on right now, literally this week, with mode. So one is mode-dependent networks, where the actual, that would be a really good fit for an engineered system that kind of does two things. So in like a spacecraft, you've got to like get into space, and that's like one mode. And then once you're in space, you've got to maneuver into like a satellite for surveillance or environmental sensing. And then you have to actually operate in space. And so you have one system that has three modes. And in the different modes, different parts can communicate with each other. And I think the mathematics of that is in this technique paradigm or approach is very recent. So implementation that way. Now, as far as the, that's very different than what you were getting at, where the agent-based models, where they're all doing the same thing all the time, but who they're interacting with is changing very rapidly.
They might or might not be, but you could take your infection model and suppose that I actually had an infection model where I modeled the individuals. The individuals move around, who they infect, the SIR probabilities are the same, but who I infect and who I'm interacting with depends on where I am.
Yeah.
And so that means that the topology of that network changes continuously. And so then typically we had Catherine Morse talking about event approaches to specifying event-based models. And that's, of course, she's been working on that for 20 some years. But how do you accommodate that? I mean, in principle, you could have alternating steps where you reconfigure the topology. You run a step of this, you reconfigure the topology of the network, you redo your calculation. And that's how we do it computationally without the elegance. In our simulation environment, we have a step where we assume that the networks are what they are, you calculate them in one time step, and you have a step which recalculates the connectivities, then you'd alternate steps. And I wondered if there was a more elegant way to do that in your world.
Yeah, I think Evan, do you have a good idea?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a really a satisfactory answer to that, except to say that, like, yeah, this is like a topic of like active research here at the Topos Institute. My colleague David Spivak is working on things like that, and we're also hoping to try to, you know, there's always a process of going, you know, getting things from the cutting edge math and actually making software out of it. So I mean, I think we're a ways away from having like that sort of stuff readily available, but it's something that we're very interested in. So
yeah, and I think thanks for buying me time to think. William and I had talked about DPO rewriting for this, where it's your neighborhood. I had shown patterns like so in this slide, this like graph rewriting thing where you've got these edges, and every time you see this pattern, you can replace it with this pattern. So you find a match, then you do the replacement. This system could be used to implement mutating the topology. So you've got to kind of pick the matches appropriately in order to execute that. But I think that's a viable technique for implementing these combinatorics of your model. Your model is at that point very combinatorial, right? You have your list of people and their list of friendship or contact relationships, contact neighborhoods are very much the data of the model, or the content of the model. And so this like mutating this combinatorial structure with rewriting is, I think, the appropriate tool for that. In addition to what Evan was talking about, David's work on polynomial functors.
So you're basically conceptualizing it. I mean, again, I'm used to things like BioNetGen, where you have a rule-based approach where you have a set of conditionalities that define when topologies change. And that lives in a separate layer from the one where the actual evaluation of the network is done. Although there's no reason you couldn't unify those.
Right. This would unify them through the what did you call them? Conditionalities under which the rules can be applied. That conditionality is just like the presence of a pattern.
So are you familiar with BioNetGen?
I am not.
Right. So I mean, just the tiny bit of background. BioNetGen and Kappa are similar stories, and it's rewriting systems for port graphs is what they are.
Oh,
stochastic rewriting of port graphs.
There you go. That's exactly what we would do. But yeah, this is why it's important to have implemented the constructions that Evan talked about, like structured Cospans, at the level of Csets, because port graphs are just an example of a Cset. So we can automatically apply all of our rewriting stuff, which works on graphs and Petri nets. I know it'll work for port graphs because they are Csets, and this implementation is correct for all Csets. So we could just rewrite port graphs. How do they, William? How do they choose the matches randomly? That part seems like the hard part.
Well, I mean, computationally hard, yeah. I mean, how do you choose them? You have a rate, and you compute the propensity of all the different possible matches. the trick is, because of course that at that point you have to really enumerate all the possible matches, which could be very expensive and very big. The trick, I don't know about BioNetGen, but the trick that Kappa uses is it basically does that once at the beginning. And often at the beginning, there isn't a very big graph, so it's not super bad, right? And then incrementally, once you've made a rule fire, you then compute what other rules that could possibly affect. So you just do you just incrementally build up the possible matches for the next step.
Okay, yeah. Owen, Owen and I were talking about that yesterday as the kind of the obvious next step. For right now, our rewriting is deterministic. You can kind of pick the first match and apply it, or you can compute all the matches. And so yeah, so our current approach to selecting a match uniformly at random is like compute all the matches, count how many matches you found, and then generate a random integer. And then you picked a match uniformly at random. But yeah, this kind of incremental, okay, once you apply a match, what new matches did you make? And what old matches did you invalidate?
Yeah, exactly.
That seems critical to getting throughput.
Yes, very much.
It's good that the obvious thing to do is the right thing to do.
Well, there might be a better thing to do, but that's what we do, and it works.
I don't mean to monopolize the conversation. There are a lot of people in the room who could ask questions. I wanted to get things started, but I didn't mean to be. Anyone? I mean, I have others. So your conceptualization of spatial relationships fundamentally is by triangulation. So you define you pre-triangulate your space, and then that gives you the set of relationships. And that's a very different point of view from a typical agent-based model where you have a concept of space as being something that really exists and has certain not network-related properties to it. And so you have concepts of things like adjacency, orientation, all of which are concepts that don't exist on graphs.
Right. So yeah, we've got our notion of space is like simplicial complexes. So yeah, those have orientation. Evan has implemented up to dimension 2. So where you're talking about surfaces in an arbitrary space. You're muted if you wanted to add it.
Oh yeah, I was just nodding along, but yeah, so we basically have the formalism of what you might call discrete differential geometry implemented on simplicial complexes up to dimension 2. So you've got, vertices, edges, and triangles.
It looks like Luis Fonseca has a question.
Thank you. Great presentation. Going back to the ODEs, you said that you're able to generate the code automatically to do parameter estimation.
Mm-hmm.
What other things can you do? Are you able to generate code automatically? Can you do like steady state stability and sensitivity analysis?
Yeah, so we would, for that kind of thing, you would take the code that, the way we do it right now is generate the code that runs the forward model. And then there's a very rich ecosystem in Julia of automatic differentiation that kind of, in the same algorithmic cost to run the model forward, it can compute the sensitivities at the same time. So that's how we would do it. And that's how we're doing it for parameter estimation as well. That we generate an interface to this like auto differentiation based parameter estimation that basically computes the gradient and then does gradient descent. Like the loss function is determined by the data, and you gradient descent to fit the data.
So it's only for gradient descent?
Well, I mean, it has lots of advanced
Other
more advanced solvers, but they're all kind of like minimize the loss by.
Yeah. One of the advantages of working in the Julia ecosystem, which is what we write our code in, is that we have access to this wealth of packages that other people have written that are very powerful. So yeah, this automatic differentiation, all sorts of optimization methods, ODE solvers. And so we take full advantage of the Julia ecosystem. So.
And does it run on your local computer or on the server?
Yeah, so far we've only been doing single node computations. I mean, you can run it on any cluster that you can install Julia on. But yeah, the distributed computing aspects are really on the roadmap for the next 6 months. We got to get distributed.
And do you use the GPU?
Yeah, so that's been on my to-do list. As soon as I find a GPU programmer, if I can trick Owen into doing it. Yeah, actually the ODE solving works on GPUs.
I've heard that's one of the reasons why I want to try Julia. Is I'm a MATLAB user.
We can liberate you.
So one of my common problems has to do. So I study metabolism, and quite often my problems deal with carbon-13 labeling of metabolism, which transforms what you think, a simple chemical reaction to be into a ocean of combinations of reactions, because rather than having two substrates react, each substrate can now have 64 different isotopomers that can react with all the others. And so it just blows up on you. And to actually be able to solve problems like these in the GPU, because it's all algebra and should be way faster.
Yeah. All of our model, like the models that we produce, or the simulators that we produce, should be GPU compatible. We haven't tried it yet, so I'm not going to say like it definitely works on GPU, but it's like based on the capabilities that I have tested before and the code that we're generating, they should work on GPU. Our code, like parallelizing our code, like the generation of the model, that part would take a little bit of work, but it also is very doable. So yeah, but especially just running the models that we're generating on the GPU should definitely.
I'll be giving it a try.
Yeah, great. Let us know. So there's a GitHub repo called Algebraic Julia, and Algebraic Petri has got the chemistry stuff. And then the issues are open, and we are pretty responsive. If you especially if you have a new modeling problem, and if you're a modeler and you want to get started, we're happy to schedule a Zoom and really get hands-on with porting your model. We'd rather spend time porting your model than have you try it, not be able to figure it out, and then quit. It'd be a lot easier it's in our interest to help you do the porting, and we have time for that.
So the advantage that I see is I work with ODEs all the time, and I need to do parameter estimation all the time. And every time I change the model, just because I have one more compartment in it, I need to rewrite everything around. I need to rewrite the parameter estimation, or if I'm doing parameter estimation rather than dynamically, if I'm doing parameter estimation at the steady state, things, and I find myself rewriting sensitivity analysis all the time, which is basically always the same thing. But because my model changed slightly, I need to recode everything.
Yeah, that's why code generation is at the core of our technique. Yes. Is that when you change the model, you have to make coordinated changes globally distributed across your code base.
Yes.
That was the motivating problem that got us started on this line of work. How do we automate those local but globally distributed coordinated changes? If you mess up any of them, code is not right.
Yep.
Odds are it won't crash. Like, it'll still run, which is the worst, because it runs and it just gives you the wrong answer.
Yes.
The crashing is better. Crashing is better because I know the code's wrong. But yeah, that was the thing that really motivated me to start working on this. We realized maybe about 6-8 months in that, like, making these changes completely infeasible. Just automate the coding, and like figuring out what to change is really hard. Just start over and generate it again.
Yes.
That's what we do.
Quite often I find myself doing that.
Yeah, the fact that you do it by hand that way is actually horrifying to me.
Yes.
But also, I totally see why you would do it that way, because it's very difficult.
Yeah. The other feature that I like is the ability to copy paste pieces of the graph. Quite often when I have those metabolic networks that are big, quite often there are reactions that are very similar in different parts of the metabolism. And so once I've coded for one, or once I've generated a way to encode them as a matrix in MATLAB, in Excel, that MATLAB can just suck in and generate, and do a simulation. But so I can just copy paste parts of that matrix, but having the ability to copy paste graphs, and that it's the same thing. It's very useful.
Right. Yeah, you can reuse components very freely. And then another part that we really like is, because we're embedded in Julia, right? That, like, all these, it's not a new programming language in which you write these models. It's not a external file format or whatever. They're data structures in this programming language. So you can write a program that returns a Petri net, like a Julia function that takes some numbers and it computes a Petri net. Or if you wanted to say, like, I want to have 5 species, and each species can have 60 of these sites where the carbon-13 attaches, whatever, generate me the Petri net. And you could just like write loops that generate the Petri net. And then you can take that as a building block and plug it into a bigger system. But you're always just like in the host programming language. So you can always just like, sometimes you just got to write loops because that's the easiest way to do it. So like for stuff like for us, like making a rectangular mesh, it's easiest to just write like, okay, you are connected to up, down, left, right, and everybody is that way. And like actually do like I plus 1, I minus 1, 2i plus 1, 2i minus, like just do the offsets. Sometimes that's the easiest thing to do. So it is good to have it just like in the programming language.
I think there was one more question. Luke, did you have a question?
Yes, I'm kind of curious. Does Julia, at least your version, does it interface with PyTorch and some of those machine learning type of packages?
Yeah, so I have a student right now who is working on where the modeling framework is like deep learning, and his code generator generates a PyTorch module. So you like specify the network, you like build up the layers in the neural net in Algebraic Julia, and then that compile, instead of producing Julia code, it produces Python code. So that is the interface right now. Julia in general can call Python functions using a library called pycall. So that is an option. I think there's like a.
So in this case, can you get then I mean Python to call Julia functions? I know the other way you've already solved it, calling Python from Julia, but I'm doing the opposite.
Oh, call Julia from Python? Yes.
Yes.
That is Christopher Kaukis has done some stuff on that,
Okay.
which I could. But yeah, I think that's an option.
So in the future, would you mind putting a couple of templates that do those from Python to Julia and Julia to Python? Is that something that you might want to consider, like examples or templates, something like that?
Sure.
All right. Thank you.